Okay, I think the flurry of people into the waiting room has thinned a little, so I'll get started. So welcome everyone to this Centre for Visual Culture seminar, New York, Lahore in dialogue with Shahzia Sikander and Salman Toor. I'm Amy Tobin. I'm a lecturer in the Department of History of Art at Cambridge and also a curator at Kettle's Yard, which is the university's modern and contemporary art gallery. And it's my very great pleasure to be chairing this event this evening at the invitation of Vivek Gupta, who has put it together. And before I introduce Vivek and our guests, Shahzia and Salman, and we go on to hear presentations from them, I have a few notes of housekeeping. So first, please ensure your microphone is muted during the presentations and that your cameras are off at that moment too. You're welcome to turn your cameras back on during the discussion and conversation that will follow. We'll also take questions and comments from the audience towards the end of the session, but please feel free to write questions in the chat at any point. And you can do this either by addressing everyone or you can send them direct to me if you would prefer. Alternatively, when we open the floor for conversation, please let us know if you have a question, either by using the chat or the raised hand function, and I will call upon you to unmute and ask your question that way. Also, please do note that we're recording this session and we hope to make the recording available very, very soon afterward. So now I'm going to introduce our wonderful panel. First, I want to introduce Vivek Gupta, who I said has masterminded this event for us today, who is the postdoctoral associate in Islamic art based at the Centre of Islamic Studies and Jesus College at the University of Cambridge. He completed his PhD in 2020 with a thesis entitled Wonder Reoriented, Manuscripts and Experience in Islamic Societies of South Asia. His most recent research on Indo-Islamic manuscripts will appear in the journals Iran, is that the right pronunciation? Yeah. And Muqanas, I hope the same is okay, later this year. And he's currently working on an exhibition at Jesus College on Shahzia Sikander's recent work. And his chapter on Sikander will appear in Intersections, Art and Islamic Cosmopolitanism, to be published this August. And Vivek is going to tell us something about this exhibition shortly. But before he does that, I want to introduce Shahzia Sikander, who's a MacArthur Award-winning artist, widely celebrated for expanding and subverting pre-modern and classical Central and South Asian miniature painting traditions and launching the form known today as neo-miniature. Sikander's multivalent and investigative work examines colonial archives to readdress Orientalist narratives in Western art history. Her career retrospective opens at the Morgan Library Museum, New York in June 2021 and travels to RISD Museum and the MFA Houston in 2022. A monograph on her work published by Herma and a children's book on Sikander as a young girl growing up in Lahore, published by Abrams and Mona, also comes out this month. So exciting. And finally, my introduction turns to Salman Toor, who's born in Lahore, Pakistan in 1983. He now lives and works in New York City. Toor received his Master's of Fine Art from the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn in 2009. And his paintings, he describes them as figurative, varying in scale and style, ranging in subject from art history, queer culture, and post-colonialism. Salman Toor, How Will I Know?, the artist's first institutional solo exhibition, is on view at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York until the 4th of April, 2021. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the CVC seminar, and I'll now hand over to Vivek.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome everyone to New York, Lahore, in dialogue with Shahzia Sikander and Salman Toor. I extend my warm thanks to Professor Caroline Van Eck, Director at the Center for Visual Culture, and Dr. Donald Cooper for supporting this event. and to Dr. Amy Tobin, curator at Kettle's Yard, and Dr. Christina Ilko for their help. The idea of this dialogue emerged from a desire to share a public conversation with two artists and friends who are having solo exhibitions in New York at the Morgan Library and Whitney Museum. To my surprise, in spite of their long-standing relationship and many points of intersection, Shahzia and Salman have never been publicly in conversation. So this platform at Cambridge is a unique opportunity of which I hope there will be more. As Shahzia and Salman's work speaks so much to the politics of identity and gender, it gives art historians like myself, who shy away from autobiography, the license to speak about ourselves. I am an art historian of Islamic and South Asian art and architecture with a keen interest in the overlaps between these two massive fields. My research has addressed issues of affect, translation, and transculturation, and I've spent the past years researching medieval and early modern manuscripts in Persian, Arabic, and Indian vernaculars. It is this interest in past traditions that initially led me to Shahzia's work and a forthcoming exhibition in planning at Jesus College. When it comes to the politics of identity, my Hindu name, Vivek Gupta, reveals little about my background. My mother is Christian and my father is Hindu, and my frequent visits to Delhi, my closest family member is my Muslim maternal aunt. This complexity is hardly uncommon for South Asians, but how studies of Islam, Pakistan, and India are institutionalized and who has the right to teach or curate can often obscure these histories. It is a complexity reflected in both the work of Shahzia and Salman. While going to high school in suburban New Jersey, my friends and I would skip school to go to New York and visit the museums. In seeing artists like Shahzia Sikander represented for global audiences at a formative age, I was given permission to exist beyond the parameters of a first-generation model minority, and I saw the possibility of committing myself to the humanities and humanistic expressions. And many years later today, it is Shahzia whose work I turn to when challenged by a work of art from the medieval or early modern world. Her ability to think with an artistic practice that has been called craft, traditional, nostalgic, or miniature has transformed how we see our past and anticipate new futures. This artist-art historian relationship sustains and informs my work. There are shades to communities in diaspora, and we cling to others who look like us, speak like us, and most importantly, love like us. This is where Salman and I find each other, the deeply specific yet universal story of a queer South Asian experience. Salman's paintings of quotidian life, of the mundane, of postmodern navel gazing, of the unrestrained pleasure of the queer brown male experience in diaspora gives people like us the right to exist in public. They allow us to bear witness to our lives. There's a long arc of queer brown artists in whose footsteps Salman follows, such as Bhupen Khakkar. The right for people of color to live freely in public constantly remains under threat. We hide in corners, shrink our bodies, remain under constant scrutiny, all while fighting for our survival. But as queer men, our ability to exist as we do also owes to the work of women such as Sikander. So many women artists have broke barriers within the artistic traditions to which Salman contributes. The performative intimacy of Toor's paintings also brings to mind many responses to the recent repealed Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code that made consensual homosexual sex illegal. Like Sikander, Toor's interventions speak across the India-Pakistan border and resonate globally. Seeing Salman represented in major collections and his willingness to share himself as an artist gives me so much hope for the future. So in the absence of our ability to sit around a table and speak about the fortuitous convergence of Shahzia and Salman's exhibitions, for the next half an hour or so, we will sit in different parts of the world and reflect on where we have been and where we are going. Despite the challenges of our present moment, the urgent propositions of Shahzia and Salman's work remains all the more prescient. So without further ado, I now invite my friends, Shahzia, to take the virtual stage, after which Salman will speak.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Vivek. So today's presentation, I will try to focus very quickly over the early years of my practice, because I'm going to follow the chart, the exhibition, Morgan exhibition, and the accompanying catalog. So the book and show were organized by Rhode Island School of Design. And I graduated from the National College of Arts in 1991, and I taught there for a little bit in 1992. I came to the US in 1993. So this period, which is early to mid 90s, it witnessed a new opening in the US as well as Europe towards artists who worked outside of commonly accepted paradigms, as well as dramatic shift in the perception of Muslims following the events of 9/11. So in this particular monograph, there is a great opportunity to engage with feminist, post-colonial lens, archival data, conversations with teachers and artists. But let's go back to the 1980s when I was growing up in Lahore. So this is a time when, you know, the Soviet-Afghan US-Pak war is unfolding, which is 1978 to 1992. So the era is Ziaul Haq's military dictatorship. There is a time of diminishing women's rights and human rights in general in Pakistan. So at that time, I was encouraged to go into humanities, be socially, politically engaged. And the decade was also marked by pivotal events like the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, you know, these are, at this time, the book talks about different inspirations and people that have inspired me and have been instrumental, but I will just mention a few. So the poets, authors, thinkers, the community leaders like Asma Jahangir, human rights activists, poets like Fahmida Riaz, who wrote about female desire and sexuality, was charged with sedition and forced into exile. Also, another mentor was the late artist Lala Rukh, co-founder of the Women Action Forum. In fact, in 1986, I worked with her at the Seymour Foundation, which was a women's resource publication center. So this is a time when I was studying mathematics at Kinnaird College for women, but getting a little insight into WAF gave me a better understanding of the intersections of community, women, and art. So I arrived at NCA in 1987 and in search for a creative environment to reflect upon the mechanisms of power and the potential for individual freedom. It was an instinctive decision for me to leave the Kinnaird College for Women, because there I felt out of sync with the overbearing, waiting for marriage culture. And this is also, you know, a time when the youth's innate need to express is obviously being stifled during the military dictatorship. So, and coming of age, one is trying to kind of find one's calling. And so a little background on the NCA. And I'm going to quote the feminist Rafia Zakaria's words here, but it was an institution whose first principle was the British colonial officer John Lockwood Kipling, which is the father of the author Rudyard Kipling. And Rafia says, a man who was instrumental in discovering the art of the subcontinent in the Orientalist practice of edifying the exotic object into the exhibited artifact of colonial domination. So Western models of teaching were prevalent, but the miniature had long been taught at NCA. The major was established in 1982 by Professor Bashir Ahmed. So miniature painting went, from what I remember in the late 80s, was still an unresolved national status and had a stigma attached to it. And it captured the paradox and of culture and nationalism far more than any other discipline that I encountered. And the term itself of course, refers to the visual traditions of South and Central Asia, book arts, illuminated manuscripts, illustrated folios, sometimes accompanying literary epic poems, religious texts, court paintings, Indian Persian styles. So how I first learned about it was by looking at reproductions in books. So the first encounter is with its facsimile. And here I'm going to show you, this is literally a photo of an image printed in the book. And here I had the opportunity to see the actual work. And you can see how it's impossible to even see some of the details like the flies around the head. Like you wouldn't be able to see any of that information in the way that one acquired a grasp of the techniques, etc. And this, unfortunately, was the situation, because when I grew up, the English colonial history and much of the art was in museums outside of the country. And so keeping that in mind, one's practice has become oriented towards looking and digging into the archives. And even though I had looked at printed images in my formative years, I still felt like the inherent eroticism and beauty of the works were incredibly imaginative. They captured my imagination, and they also challenged my own assumptions. So in this sort of interest in reimagining the past, in rereading the historical works was sparked. And the manuscripts often would have been cut out and dispersed for profit. And so it was a very truncated canon that one was going to engage with. So the more I became attuned to miniature painting's complicated provenance, the more it yielded to new narratives. And the scroll was my iconic work, which garnered many awards, exhibitions, press, and it also led to increased enrollment in the NCA program. And it emerged as a tipping point to rest the debate about miniatures' inability to engage the youth. The work was created over a year and depicts various stages where the young adult female protagonist defies bodily restrictions by becoming an elastic, transparent, moving, morphing form, almost like a ghost. So this claiming of the freedom of the body was one of the defining emotions in this work. The work was always interrogating colonial, post-colonial histories, pictorial traditions that did not sit in the center of Western art history. So I was engaged with feminist protagonists, but not in any autobiographical, literal manner. So the work that I was making was not about myself, but it did get glossed over in the 1990s, often straitjacketed in terms of my biography. The essentialization often of the other is deep-rooted in the West's imagination, polarizing dichotomies that have existed, such as East-West, Islamic Western, Asian white, oppressive free. Encountering such prevalent binaries themselves in the early years led to an outburst of iconography of fragmented and severed bodies, androgynous forms, armless and headless torsos, self-rooted, floating, half-human figures, forms that refuse to be fixed, to be grounded, or to be stereotyped. So many of these iconographies were resisting categorization. I was responding to my inability to locate brown South Asian representation in the feminist space in the 1990s art history books. The monolithic category, third world feminism, felt offensive and limiting, while it also pointed out white feminism's blind spots and exclusions. So at this time, much of the iconographies are breaching national boundaries also. And I am engaging with many scholars and reading Ismat Chugtai, Kishore Nahid, Parveen Shakir, and juxtaposing that with Angela Carter, Julia Kristeva, Helen Susu, Bell Hooks, Nancy Sparrow, Eva Hasse. So all sorts of feminist forms that in turn were exploring language from specific points and places of women's narratives. by dislocating context and intimacy across race and sexuality, to reread the text from new perspectives, and by reorganizing the framing devices of center margin within the miniature tradition, I was able to open up the narratives of gender and sexuality simultaneously. The female forms in these small and large paintings that I was making, as well as the video animations later on, became, both monstrous and playful. So here is also works that I started to engage with other artists. This was a friend of mine, Donna, the late artist Donna Maria Bruton, and this was also, she, as painters of women of color, we both shared concerns about the white art world and patriarchal societies. So the collaborations we worked on led to a gathering of forms at once monstrous, and at the same time, engaged with representations like the cage-like form that is on the left, which is called Housed. It has a lurking pink heart. The painting tapped into my anxiety of being boxed into a stereotype on behalf of a culture or a religion. So the haunted image of this form is in response to the Orientalist obsession with the veil in the Western imagination. And is it perforated? Is it an armor, a shelter, a mask, or a shell? In this work, Cinderella's prince holds the slipper at the center, while a powerful heroine takes control above as a reimagined Red Riding Hood. So-called Western fairy tales were part of my childhood storybooks in Pakistan. Like many stories, they carry deeply entrenched gender bias. When I started examining miniature painting as a young adult, the passive depictions of women often perturbed me. I wanted to make protagonists who were proactive, playful, confident, intelligent, and connected to the past in exciting ways. So I started dissecting coffee table style, big, luxurious books, often on Islamic art or Indian art that were very prevalent in the West. And as I looked through them, there was always these categories that covered aspects in simplistic, often repetitive manner. So the more I started imagining these shadowless representations of bold jewelry, objects, swords, vessels, cannons, amulets, masks, they started to emerge in my mind as little monsters that I could animate and thus step out of the books into their own power. To me, this was an inventive and ironic play on the colonial histories of dispersing, rupturing, archiving, cataloging, and institutionalizing art and artifacts of native cultures. Which brings me to the work Choli ke piche kya, chunri ke niche kya. So the title referred to a song in the popular Bollywood film Khalnayak. It was a mega hit song, staple at parties and drag performances in queer spaces throughout South Asia and the diaspora in the 1990s. In this work, I'm going to quote the gender and sexuality scholar Gayatri Gopinath. She argues that what is revealed under the choli and chunri is both female and not female, dismembered, remembered, multi-membered. Sikander mobilizes a queer optic that sees gender and sexuality outside a conventional visual logic of secrecy, disclosure, invisibility, visibility. The queer optic instead allows us to see an alternative cyclical looping, layered logic of gender and sexuality, where the body exists in excess of gender itself. It sprouts limbs and lotuses, it endlessly repeats, doubles, multiplies, and circles back on itself. So these sort of conventional nationalistic diasporic discourses intersected in the evocation of the past as a site of authentic cultural tradition, often in terms that are deeply gendered and sexualized. Female bodies typically bear the symbolic weight of communal identities, while non-heteronormative desires are cast as foreign and inauthentic. Sikander's work reorients this backward glance of dominant articulations of both nation and diaspora. Her turn to tradition is radically anti-nostalgic in that she both utilizes and deconstructs the idiom of Indo-Persian visual traditions in order to imagine a different present and future. In this sense, her work enacts what queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz calls a backward glance that enacts a future vision, or what he terms a forward dawning futurity of queer utopian possibility. So I have developed a pageant of archetypes which celebrate female sensuality and desire. There are self-portraits as well that are interlaced within such works. This particular one, the ram's horns co-joining fragmented bodies, also suggests commonalities, hybridity, multiplicity, and a continual state of becoming. After the attacks of 9/11, the work itself further evolved with the addition of jet planes in response to the paternalistic justifications for the war in Afghanistan as saving Muslim women. The work points to a more joyous, sensual depictions of feminine power. Androgyny was also a subject often explored in the work. In this particular one, two self-portraits flank a subway map, and rooftop water tanks in the top margin further signal a New York City setting. In the lower register, courtiers from the historical painting, now mass gather, perhaps as witnesses of the past. So presiding in the center and on the right is the Bodhisattva, and I'm using it as a non-binary and a symbol of multitude with the ability to look in all directions and possess any form. Indian celestial dancers modeled on a sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The dancer here, they flirtatiously entwine with a figure drawn from the Italian Mannerist painting, An Allegory with Venus and Cupid by Bronzino. So what I did was I pulled out the protagonist that I had already sketched. And the reason why I did that was throughout my 90s practice, whenever I was making small drawings, I would pull elements out of those and make them into larger works, and the reaction would be completely different. So I thought, why don't I make the protagonists are already in there, why don't I pull them out and see what happens? And that's where this current work, Promiscuous Intimacy, steps into. And the title again is borrowed from Gopinath's essay on the work. And it was also the time when I was part of this conference with New York City Mayor's Conference on Advisory Commission on City Arts Monuments Markers. And during that process, I was hearing very differing public opinions around public monuments, their complicated histories. So at that time, I thought that if I ever made a sculpture, it would be an anti-monument. And that's where, as well as something which would not be the overt male representations that most monuments were. So with its sinuous entanglement of the Greco-Roman Venus and the Indian Apsara Devata, explores the promiscuous intimacies of multiple times, spaces, art historical traditions, bodies, desires, and subjectivities. In their suggestive embrace, the intertwined female bodies are also across multiple geographic terrains. So when I research historical paintings, I inspire to cultivate new associations for trenchant historical symbols from more than one vantage point. I have employed ideas around time, space, monumentality, movement in imagining new relationships with painterly traditions, as well as with iconographies of small paintings. So here also is pulling out elements from within the work into a infinite space of sorts, where I was again thinking how to break the preciousness of the small works too. So all these works are done on thin paper. They are where the drawings are done on site, as well as the wall murals were done on site. So there was a urgency of time and scale and space that contributed into the work too. And the nature of the work is that it's really large and spreads everywhere. It looks fragile, but it's quite stable and strong. And so it was built on these like oppositional elements where you could see through and see everything, yet it depended where you were viewing it from, and it would give different positions and viewpoints. And based on some of those works, I was able to then bring iconographies that were developing on the tissue paper in a very different manner and bring them right back into the miniature. So here, the uprooted order, the lotus floats over the central figure and acknowledges the umbilical cord as literally the life force of the mother. And this also is about the syncretic histories and traditions, Jain, Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, Zoroastrian, Christian. Often my works would always be seen as Hindu Muslim, yet there was so much more complexity in the evolvement of the iconography. And here, the central character on the left attempts to pin down with its one foot the ghost-like female. It suggests the paradox of rootedness. So for me, in a place like Houston, with its multiple immigrant narratives and nationalisms, I was wanting to address the fallacy of assimilation versus foreignness. In the uprooted order on the right, my ghostly figure merges here with Radha, a gopi who is often depicted in Hindu iconography as the preferred lover of Krishna. Now, Krishna has been removed from the equation. So by placing all these characters, she holds a chalava in her arms. I was also exploring how different iconographies can mean different things, and how they can have how some of that context would evolve if I let other artists explore and participate in my work. So in this painting, Segments of Desire Go Wandering Off, it is a collaboration again with David McGee, Houston-based artist, and all the faces have been obscured, keeping racial cultural identities shifting. So as an immigrant, I was questioning the prevalence of hyphenated identities in America and who is recognized as a citizen. So he contributed with a large graphite portrait of a clown symbolizing the trickster. So my interest in sociology, psychoanalysis, space of examining how culture, society shape the imagination are all fodder. How violence, systemic racism, class, and cultural fears are deeply entrenched in media and political representations, be it the fear of the unknown, the migrant, the immigrant, the Muslim, the LGBTQ, the other, and how the various fault lines of race, class, gender also intersect in various ways around capitalism. So a broader understanding of feminism and social justice is part of the progress of moving forward. And much of this work that was done, in the 90s still propels forward so much of the iconographies that I continuously engage with. Ready to leave. So here, the eagle-lion hybrid is from the Greek myth, but then the Punjabi enters the Punjabi, making the griffin into the chalava. So chalava is a ghost. In my usage, it's somebody who is so swift and transient, you can't pin down who they are. In Houston, I was also engaging with artists and programs at Project Row Houses, and the works started to celebrate the artist organizations that I was coming in contact with. So I made this armorial bearing on the left, but I was also looking at the representation of Black and medieval West. And I wanted to counter the derogatory representation, and as seen in the silhouetted figures in the shields. So my construction of the armorial seal is with the row houses was also to address politicized contemporary representations of both the Muslim feminine as well as the representation of Black. So this is also where I was kind of interested in understanding what subcultures like Nation of Islam were. So this all happening in the South. So having moved to Texas, I was able to understand much more dynamics of what it encompassed being Asian American. And it was not just South Asians, but new immigrant groups, West Asians, Arab Americans, Cambodian Americans. So it started to expand the historical and geographical parameters of the terms itself. And at that time, I was also being invited. So one significant work around borders, barriers, and framing devices was done in September 1999. And here, the two figures that are present in the center are referencing the Statue of Liberty, the other questioning who is veiled. They hold between them a piece of American currency inscribed with a quote from the Quran, which then of your Lord's blessings do you both deny? So the surrounding figures speak to the shifting global alliances between Muslim leaders and the American capital and empire. And this is a time when, America is flexing its military muscle around the world. And I proposed that American foreign policy in Islamic countries would become a defining issue in the next millennium. So these sort of iconoclastic.
Sorry, I'm just looking at time.
Okay.
Could we?
I'm going to end.
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I had asked Vivek to tell me that.
Yes, I did, but it was just so we can listen to you speak forever.
Yeah, so good.
And
okay, so I am gonna end right here, and
we will
stop sharing my screen.
We will now turn it over to. You gave us so much to think about, and we have many more opportunities to speak with each other soon, and now we should just turn it over to Salman so he can share his short presentation. Salman?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Shahzia. That was, as always, it was just amazing to look at so much, work. Can everyone see the shared screen?
You should play, yeah. There
you go. Okay, so I'm just gonna go through some key images that reflect some of the things that are important to me in the painting. My work is figurative. It's based on memory and derived from personal fantasies about queer relationships, empathy, art history, and the perception of difference. It's also about self-love, about having fun, about the warmth of belonging to a community while also being an outsider. I like to think they're funny too. People in them, mostly boys, are marionette or puppet-like figures, slightly silly looking, with long noses and slouching shoulders, and inward, shy self-presentation. To me, they're cobbled together from different parts with rubbery, frail arms. I like my figures to move between postures of empowerment and passivity, between being recognizable types of people who live in Western metropolises and to Americans, unknown strangers from the developing world. Unlike in real life, in painting, I like that I can bring them together because I relate as both kinds of people here in New York City. I had a conservative middle-class upbringing in Lahore. I went to an all-boys colonial prep school with a beautiful campus and lots of homophobia. So on the one hand, I was bullied and made fun of for being super femme, but on the other hand, I was also respected for my drawing skills. And so being an artist was kind of a safe space for me at an early age. When I moved to New York City, I was full of my recent education in art history. This is a painting from 2000. This was a painting from 2011. This is a painting from 2014. I just thought I'd go a little bit back in time to show where I'm sort of coming from. I just wanted to paint like Rubens and Van Dyck and Titian. I was, going to the museums in London, and I was living in New York. So I was just haunting the Met and the Frick all the time. And I wanted to study the surfaces of these paintings and try to recreate that in the studio. And I thought of myself really as a historian who, a technical historian really who painted at the time. So I was showing mainly in Pakistan and a small gallery here I call Icon in New York. At the time, I felt I was talking to other South Asians instead of really to any Americans through my painting. I felt like I was learning, getting my education here and sort of using that language to speak to people in South Asia and in the Middle East. So at that time, I was doing paintings about the tension of class relationships there. This is from 2014. It's a young bartender, rich urban types admiring him in their party costumes. A lot of these paintings are oblique essays on desire and subversiveness. These were shown in Karachi mostly at Canvas Gallery. My paintings were always really well received in Pakistan, so I was very happy about that. This one is called Halloween Party. This is also from 2014. I was, figuring out how to construct groups of people in compositions and kind of learn to do textures and costumes and social tropes. So after I graduated from Pratt in 2009, I applied for an extraordinary ability petition to get a green card. The petition is for the US government to grant a green card to someone who could benefit their chosen field in some significant way in the United States. The only person I knew who had that was Shahzia, and she wrote me a wonderful recommendation, so thank you. It took a year, but I got it in the end. That year in 2011, I remember feeling I needed to make work conversing with American culture more directly. I had been here for many years. One of my friends looked at my paintings and said a very simple thing that has always stayed with me. And he said, well, I love how this is painted, but what's contemporary about this? And I thought of that for a very long time. I'd been to grad school, but I don't know, maybe it was the person who said it, or maybe it was a sentence. There was something in it. So it got under my skin. I thought it was a great question. I was getting tired of using models and pictures and taking a long time to produce a painting when I had so many ideas. So this is a painting from 2012. I retouched it until 2015, but really it was finished in 2012, more or less. And it's a good image to kind of illustrate the transition from academic style painting to a looser style, working directly from imagination, trying to push myself out of my comfort zone. So my studio at this time was like 100 square feet, and this was like a 8-foot high painting. And so I couldn't really see it until years later. It was in a gallery show. It was done really in 2012. In 2015, I did a few changes, then it was in a show, and then I finally saw it. So I had a vague idea that I wanted to paint a sad family portrait, and mostly almost like a coming out scene. There's a lot happening in this canvas. I wanted to kind of kick out as far as possible from my comfort place and just try to be a rock star in some way. This is me being a rock star. It's not it's not too crazy. So there's the protagonist is a naked, skinny, green figure in a pose of supplication. Behind him is a TV on which a news anchor appears. I thought of her as a kind of mascot for the larger context in which these characters exist. That is a kind of patriarchal, conservative social system. And I added these boom pow signs and exclamation points above his head. There was something violent and depressing about them that made sense to me at the time. By 2017, I'd started making unplanned autobiographical work. I was making paintings to hang in my apartment, really. And these were images quickly painted as an illustration almost for a graphic novel. By this time, I felt I wasn't just addressing expat South Asians, but also Americans. And I'd become interested in how I fit in the American context as an outsider who had found freedom here, who was thinking about the idea of assimilation, about being foreign, about never really belonging anywhere and being okay with that. And here I was thinking of a reflected self-portrait through the eyes of a gatekeeper or immigration officer at a border of the free world. They're both sort of meditative characters in an inward state of powerlessness. I was thinking of pointers through which decisions about the passage into the free world are made. This became a recurring image. Sometimes I just wanted to paint, period costume. These were unplanned paintings most of the time. So, the chance played a role in them. And I sort of tried to, a lot of the times imagine that I was just bored in some maths class in high school. And that's when the painting usually worked for me. So some people look like they might be from another time altogether. The style of painting shifted for me, very comfortably between cartooning and various pre-industrial and post-impressionist languages of oil painting. Um, and what started as a specific instance of immigration eventually transformed into a surreal and metaphorical space, an inner space rather than a literal one. None of this was new, what I was doing with figurative painting. The culture became interested in minorities and queer culture and people of color. I'm very lucky to be working at a time when the culture wants to consume the experiences that I'm offering in the paintings. There were larger questions of who is the rightful inheritor of the tradition of Western painting. Do these traditions even work for people from the outside the Western world? Or are they relevant today? And I like to think they work for me, even though I have a complicated relationship with European old masters. When I go into a museum, I absolutely love what I'm looking at, but they're also citizens of kingdoms and republics that were beneficiaries of imperial rule abroad. Dutch genre painting, which I love, would not have been possible without its trade posts in India, its violence in the Nutmeg Islands. Matisse and Gauguin would not fertilize Western art with colors and patterns and bodies inspired by Tahiti and Algiers. Velasquez, as a young genius, would not have access to a world-class collection of art in the palaces of Philip IV if the American Empire didn't exist to maintain that collection. So coming back to my paintings, they're just also, I guess, like arrangements of portraits and modern still life and things that I was interested in to begin with. I'm interested in how poor and foreign people of color can be portrayed in the language of figurative painting. There's a history of this in European painting and even in the miniature painting tradition of Iran and South Asia. What is the relationship of these poor outsiders to refinement, to high culture in the Western world and in their native culture? The paintings move between public and private spaces, the dangers and anxiety in a public space, the cozy safety of private space. I wanted to pit the coolness of these sort of imaginary characters against the anxiety-causing form of the police officer. America's story has changed irreversibly after George Floyd, among many, many other victims. And we live now with the fact of the criminally reductive ways in which we are often seen by armed authority figures. Green is a color I like to use a lot in monochrome. Emotionally, to me, it's a glamorous and inviting color on the one hand, but we have poisonous and evil associations with it. Kryptonite, absinthe, Toulouse-Lautrec. But it might be, it's also a nocturnal color to me and free of sentimentality. Unlike all the time in my own life, but straddles between two cultures, the figures in my paintings appear to be comfortable, bourgeois, and totally liberated. I like painting fashion. Even when I went to museums, I realized that I like the fashion in like period costume and paintings that I really loved looking at. To see, what materials were, how they were painted, if they were expensive, if they looked cheap or local, or or from abroad. Cuffs, cups, seams and sleeves, embroideries, brocade, textures. This is a charcoal and ink drawing. I also I sort of started like a series of these drawings that resemble each other. I'm not sure if it's a series. I don't usually think in terms of series, but the figures who I think of as the keepers of tradition and rightful inheritors of conservative traditions, the traditions that are conservative in my head and my experience. I think of this as a bunch of the elders who reappear in my paintings, either by themselves or in larger compositions. Sometimes they stand in the back and listen to music, appealing differently to all the groups of people in this painting. And the painting is called A Music Room. It's on view at Luring Augustine Gallery in Bushwick until April 10th. It's a fantasy image about unforgiving, often, in my experience, homophobic tradition coming together with a progressive and permissive world under the influence of music. As the music plays from musicians on the right to the ghost of a European violinist on the left, the forms become liquid and pool and spread on the floor and along the walls. In this moment, biases are forgotten. A world where various queer couplings in the composition is a miraculously seamless part of the world of tradition that in real life so often excludes and shuns difference and diversity. The composition hints at a parallel abandoned history of traditions that are assumed to be incompatible with modern life. The work also has a narrative of an audience listening to two kinds of music at once as an allegory of a mixed cultural heritage. At other times, there's a direct confrontation and a story of complicity. Sometimes compositions are a struggle between staying true to a traumatic memory and what works in the composition. As in a moment or experience of trauma, there's an effort in such paintings to make the attention escape into details, like the slouching shoulders of the watchers, the trembling shadow of plants, for example. It's therapeutic to tie this reimagining of trauma to bits and pieces of art history that are sort of etched on my brain, like Goya's 3rd of May, or the pantomime of violence and the work of Jacob Lawrence. Um, The poise of the watchers is the poise of so many worshippers and witnesses to tragedy from European and Indian traditions of painting. This painting is titled Nightmare. It's also, it's part of the Whitney show. It's, I created this especially for the Whitney show, and I wanted to create something that was based on the terror of queer bashing. There is an ambiguous relationship between the three participants. The figure on the ground is reaching out or shielding himself among his clothing sprawling around him. Somehow, the mullioned diamond pattern on his shirt made me think of the safety of a sanctuary. I like the idea of domesticity, plush comfort, the dainty flounciness of interiors like this one. They're half funny images of vanity. I like to create almost that sense of Christian light as a light of excitement, discovery, power, of tragedy. It's a way of giving dignity and reflection for me. Technology and portraiture are related to the idea of selfhood, an artist presenting himself in a studio and becoming this sort of, strong POC and fashionable and inhabiting their power. The theme of reflection, of seeing and being seen, is a recurring one in my paintings. There's an enjoyment in painting deliberately skinny, hairy, dark bodies that tickle racial anxieties and assumptions about cleanliness, good manners, the trappings of bourgeois life and wealth. I keep a little sketchbook with ballpoint sketches, and sometimes I refine sketches as they become paintings. I like the idea, I just wanted to share this because I love the idea of the animal being loved, and the animal loves back unconditionally. And coming from, I think, experiencing traditions where people can grow up with a threat of conditional love from, loved ones or friends or whatever, because of, some innate difference. Is just very special. So I just wanted to also just share some examples of sketches, how they develop. They're done in ballpoint, and I like to use ballpoint because it doesn't smudge like a pencil. I'm not sure how that ages, but we'll see. So, sometimes they make it to painting. Some, like this one didn't. I didn't think this was strong enough to be. I'd done too many paintings like this, but maybe I'll do one later. This one might become a painting. I'm trying to remember like sashaying down a corridor in high school, and I don't know. Maybe let's see. Just a bunch of like felt tip drawings. This was a particular sketch that I thought about. I did in 2018. I'd seen a bartender with braids and a leather vest in a bar called Cobra Club, which is very close to my studio in Bushwick. And I thought I have to paint that. I just absolutely have to do it. And then I saw the mayonnaise barmaid in the Courtauld Institute in London, and at the the bar at the Folies Bergère, and so that ended up. And I knew that I wanted to do that painting. I wasn't looking at that painting, but I did have a very good memory of it. So I ended up with this in mayonnaise painting. There is a hint that behind the bartender, there is a mirror, making you the person who's speaking to him reflected in the mirror. And I wanted 2 or 3 points of focus in the composition. The boys making out, the conversations, the dancing in the background, but all sort of competing and surrendering to the gaze of this one protagonist. This led me to other similar paintings, which I think of as my night paintings. It's great fun to paint costumes, and painting for me is a little bit like being a stylist, which I like. I like placing these kinds of images of together side by side, scenes of easy domestic life and freedom to be yourself in public spaces, with images of metaphorical severing and heaping. I think of these as fag bottles, a heap of limbs and various objects that look like something pathetic, like abandonment or leftover to be thrown away, or the idea of treasure, or like a biblical idea of mammon. Um, in Parts and Things, which is what this painting is called, it's also in the Whitney show. It's kind of, this was the first sort of fag bottle I did, and I didn't mean it to be creepy, but it turned out pretty creepy. So, there's just lots of stuff in here. There's a boa, broomstick, light bulb, belts, hangers, and the heap is kind of a collection of things that I want to paint. Like I love this Rococo shoe, the ribbon and pearls, and darn socks, and the mooning ass. Um, and together, these objects make a sort of landscape with a sad little flag waving in the wind on top of the patched travel bag perched on the ass. Um, but maybe this heap is a place where you can go to put on a new permutation of parts for a new situation as you need them. To me, this fag bottle is also an allegory of the excruciating kind of realignment of the self, constantly moving between cultures, failing to fully translate, oozing lust and a sense of abandoned treasure. Um, so this painting is on view also at the Louis Augustine Gallery in Bushwick until April 10th. There are 3 paintings in the show. They're installed in the space with an 18th century sandstone facade of a quote unquote pleasure pavilion from Agra in India. And the show, well, every month the gallery has an artist from the roster to show work with it. And my show just started, so I'm very, very excited. I'm so honored to show these works in conversation with this incredibly ornate symbol of majesty and repose in the imagination, at least. But this structure also speaks of the imperial rule of Muslim Mughals who ruled over India for 3 centuries and themselves were beginning to fall prey to the imperial ambitions of the British East India Company by the end of the 18th century. So the use of sandstone to create structures like this was a synthesis of local materials and artisans, creating a wonderful mixed up hybrid of Hindu and Persian architectural forms. So just to show, I have like a little view of these two, and then the third work, which is called Art Room. I've been thinking lately of more allegorical, magical spaces rather than literal pictures of living in East Village and working in Bushwick or Lahore. This painting is titled Art Room. It's a sculptural space with, I was trying to go for an idea of like an apparition. This sort of apparition appears before on the right to the other person in the beanie hat. And these imaginary objects, and these people are trying to understand each other from across this distance of art between them. So these imaginary objects are an idea to me also of like a made up world, like a invented imperial plunder and repose, a historical narrative created from an unknown point of view. There are various tropes of freedom, the spirit of humanism embodied in the nude form, lots of white marble and a head in the prison of a vitrine, with marble busts on the right standing sentinel to the ambiguous communication that's happening between these two figures. That's all, thanks.
Thank you, Salman. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
If you can stop sharing your screen, we can go into gallery view. And we have had so many questions that Amy is going to have the pleasure of having to parse through when the discussion starts with the audience. But as the convener of this, I'm going to take the license to ask both of you a special question that I think is what this medium can allow us to ask is, when was the first time you first encountered each other's works, and how do you remember that today? How do you remember that, and especially from the point of view of doing these major exhibitions now? Either of you can start, but I think.
All right, I'll go first.
Yeah, exactly.
I saw Shahzia's work when I must have been late in high school or maybe like early college. I don't remember the exact year, but it was a thesis show. And this was the image that Shahzia, it was, to me, it's like the Shahzia image, which is the panoramic view of the of domestic life in this very, familiar sort of home to me of this person kind of strolling through the house. It's, to me, it was like a slightly feminist image and in my imagination. And I also wrote about it much later on. But at the time, I just remember everyone being aghast at this person's like talent and dexterity and ambition, because it was one of the first times that I had been to an NCA thesis show. um, Shazia's work also opened up that world for me, which was very um, an NCA-centric world, which was like, I'd never known an art school really, the culture of an art school in Lahore, and the freedom and the permissiveness and the freakishness and the fun of it was like such joy, and that anyway that was opened up by going to that show, and it was so that was the first time I encountered it.
How old were you? We're in high school?
I don't know. I must have been late. It must have been late high school, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I heard, Salman was in New York. And I was like, most kids would often, I was always being called either from home or from Pakistan, or so and so is somewhere in some particular university. And, they're going to call you. Can you reach out? So then you worked in the studio for a little bit.
Yes, it's so fun. I mean, I had no idea what the life of an artist is like, and I was very curious, but also kind of a little bit terrified to find out what is it like. What will I have to do to live this life? And it was really, really informative, but it was also pretty intimidating to be in your studio because I was putting together like a list of just press for you, and it just was endless. It was like, oh my God, you've been in everything. You've been on, like, it's just incredible. And it was also a pleasure to draw for you and like learn a little bit of the technique of the sharpening. And it's a much more meditative
Oh yeah,
practice than like a large scale oil painting, for instance.
I was just telling Shahzia yesterday that I'm thinking of writing a paper called A Female Ustad, where basically it's about how what she has represented for an entire generation of artists. But also going into both of your studios, I've always been struck about how playful and free your studio experience is, and how different that is from art history, which can be very oppressive and very rigid in how it approaches and understands artists. So the relationship between artist and art historian is really important. There's so many questions, and I don't want to monopolize time, so I asked the one question that I really thought was important. So Amy, if you have a question or you want to start moderating some of the questions, I think it would be great now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have so many questions of my own, but I'll hold my tongue and hope that there's another occasion to ask them. But maybe one question we could take is from Amna, who asks to both of you, in your journeys of growing and evolving as artists, how important has the role of geographical location been on the works that you've made? And have you consciously tried to make works palpable for Western sensibilities, or in contrast, palpable for South Asian diaspora in the US?
Do you want to go first, Shahzia?
Sure. I think the geography for me has been really important because I did not initially understand that pursuing miniature or moving forward in that space, what that actually meant. It was slower, but as soon as I understood that what I really needed to see was the actual material, the archives. Archives were so important. They were the sort of core of why I was making art. So majority of that, in fact, all of it is outside of the country. There might have been a few miniatures I saw at the Lahore Museum, and some might be in private collections, but to really get an understanding of the significant works, their provenance, and how the works got into the collections that they got into, the very, problematic history there. That became key. And once I understood that, then I followed the archives. So the geography was resolved in that way, which is very different from, being, which I think, as Vivek said, is a little bit, I see my practice a little bit like a art historian's practice. So that's how I would, that's of course in a nutshell, but early 90s, of course, the climate's very different from what it is now. There are people like Vivek, for example, organizing this event. There were fewer voices. There was no internet, so conversations couldn't happen in this manner, even though you may have been having conversations within your work and being very actively informed, but still you were often kept in a bubble, especially no matter how provocative your work may have been. But if there was no space in the West's imagination, then you were still relegated as a token artist. So there's also a lot of that unfolded far more dramatically in the 90s than I would argue it's far less. And I'm sure Salman can speak to that.
Absolutely. In the 90s and early 2000s, when I came here, when I applied to college, 9/11 happened, and so I sort of saw the first probably like 5 to 7 years of being in the US, in the Midwest, for me was just looking at it through the lens of American relationship to our region, just based on foreign policy. There was I think like a pressure and a mandate for artists from that region to an expectation rather than pressure to produce regional intelligence for Americans, and so the conversation was completely different from the one that this culture has to the global world now, compared to then, and especially that our part of the world. For me, I think it does matter like where I'm painting, coming back to the original question, because I feel like I'm in conversation with the culture that I'm living in. I feel like I really absorb like a sponge the waters that I'm in, and so I feel like if I had, I try very hard to create, and it annoys me to create work when it's very, very specific and when it's in the moment, speaking very plainly, when it's like, about technology that may be relevant, like 10 years from now. I hope it won't be, but that does bother me. And so like, I try to create images that are more universal. But to me, that is a little bit of a challenge, because I feel like if, ideally I would make a show in which I would have a conversation with the Northern Hemisphere of the world, as well as Pakistan and Middle East. I don't know, maybe we can think of a traveling show or something, but it does matter. There is, in my social life, or just taking the train to work every day, like I feel like there are signals. I am absorbing people's feelings, their faces, and it all spews out in my work. So it's different when I spend time in Lahore. There is, proximity to a lot of abject poverty. There's a lot of natural beauty. A lot of my friends live there. I have, a lot of love in that region. And so that spews out when I'm working there. So, like I was there recently, shortly to see my family, and I ended up just making work about, about father figures, like so it matters, in short.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and gather together a few questions that sort of will refer to in various ways citations or references or influences. So bear with me while I try and make this work and make sense. So Salman, there's some questions, specific ones about the titles of your paintings and the references that you might make to Lautrec, Manet, Goya, Rubens, which you reinterpret. But there's also a question about Shamsuddin and expressionism, and is that an influence? And another small one that I'll just tail onto that is about someone asks, Mahir asks, what do the elongated noses mean to you? And so, maybe if you want to take that, and I'll gather some together for Shahzia to follow.
Just very, quickly, yes, I love Shamsuddin. And it's just the paint is absolutely delicious. There's so much of it slathered on to the surfaces. And I wish I could be that brave with paint, but it takes a long time to dry. I would just look at those surfaces as like, oh wow, I mean, you must have put this away for so long to make it, for it to dry out. And the fleshiness of the paint and the gooiness of it, it just revels in its own medium completely. And sorry, what was the other question?
So the titles and references to Manet, Lautrec, Goya, Rubens.
The titles, I like to make up titles as if they were found objects, which is the exact opposite of what Shahzia does in some of the archival kind of research, which is that titles given by sort of imperialists or otherwise like private collectors to images in folios, or they're just given titles, and the originals might not even have a title, and so, but I like to create titles that are very obvious about what's happening in the picture, rather than letting the title take away from the painting.
Cool. And what about the noses?
Oh yes. So I I wanted to start. I think my hand sort of traced out this more like children's illustration, fairy tale language, and I wanted the characters to be a little bit wooden looking, like Pinocchio, and to have this sense of powerlessness, but not with a lot of sanctimoniousness, or like absolute, like not like a pity party from hell, but like more like, these are sort of silly characters, and it's very important to me that a sense of fun remain in most of the images like that.
I mean, I would add here just a reference to the work of Sonal Kullar, who's talked about the worldly affiliations of artistic practice, particularly in the 20th century in South Asian art, to be specific, but in both Shahzia and Salman, we see these worldly affiliations playing out to different ends in a way. And the medium really dictates a lot of things. So with oil painting, there's a history there, and there's a history of how people actually look at oil painting and how who understands it. And with traditional painting practices, which we now sometimes call miniature, it is very, very it dictates a lot of who's looking. So I mean, I think that one of the other questions that Firuza Melville asked about the different kinds of citations that Shahzia is drawn to as well in her practice. So Shahzia, if you want to sort of think about or expand on your what images you work on and how, I mean, one of the other things that's so fascinating that I've seen in your work is just a devotion to perfecting one kind of image over a long period of time. So for example, the sculpture, which is now a sculpture, which started as a painting, started as a drawing, and you worked on it over and over again in different ways. I think these are, if you have any comments on that, that would be really great. Can't hear you.
Sorry. Yes. So yeah, I think the practice is so rooted in developing a lexicon of forms. And for me, that has been like writing. And I can archive that language, and I can re-engage it in different combinations. So that sort of way of culling out the essence of something is also about how do you cast a relationship with, with this broad idea, very abstract idea of whatever that means is tradition. So how do you perform tradition? How do you cast your connection with it? And for me, visually, that's always been about regurgitating. And possibly in that process, there's going to be some form of ownership. And that sort of was that process gets enacted through drawing. So all my practice is really like a thinker. It's connected to the act of drawing. And then with drawing, I can collaborate with music, with scoring, with sculpture, with animation, and so forth. So that idea is very rooted. I think that's what I gathered from understanding and seeing a lot of the historical manuscripts, is that how expansive drawing can be. Of course, we can call them, they're paintings on paper, but nonetheless, there was always this thing that you weren't stretching pigment on canvas. So automatically you were stepping outside of the Western canon. And if you did so, then you had to really, I'm engaging with the parallel, with like a language that on purpose sits outside of the Western canon, and to dig deeper and to understand where these separations, or where some of these deep-rooted rifts occur in terms of, West fascination with the East also, and in terms of how so much of different modernisms, and how modernism itself is built on this kind of movement of resources, and movements of bodies, and movements of histories and knowledge, and what that means in a space like art history. Who gets to tell whose story? So that's where the iconographies kind of emerge.
On one hand, it is outside of the canon, but we're now starting to see artists like Rembrandt, who had an interest in Mughal painting and was sort of working with Mughal iconography.
Absolutely. I think, Vivek, these were the well-kept secrets, right? We always understand on how, Mughal painting was informed by Northern Dutch or prints that came, but how about imagining some of that influencing the West? And so much of it is very evident, but you would never really hear that or read that in art history books, and you still don't, because it's so myopic, and you have to like focus on your particular expertise and specialize in a particular way. And how do you, so as a visual artist, I could take so much more liberty. So for example, a project that I did where I was thinking of an attributed painter like Ghulam, like Chela, for example, Farooq Chela. And then also, what if Farooq Chela is at the same time as El Greco? And what if they were lovers? How would you create a work based on that projection? So liberties of this nature, where you can tie in many aspects of not just identity and sexuality, but actually art historical canons and how to sort of puncture them.
Yeah, and I think that's really why when I have a problem, I go to your work and to look for the expansiveness of tradition and how it can be problematized. And for Salman, you know, the other thing that's so interesting is we're seeing this in art history, we're seeing this sort of explosion of work on Qajar oil paintings right now. We're seeing this sort of explosion of work on even Egyptian oil paintings where, you know, we're seeing how oil painting itself is not just this sort of Western practice and actually has so many global ramifications and how that idea that, you know, just because you're a person of color working in this medium or, you know, and whatever term we want to use, a Pakistani person living in diaspora working in this medium doesn't make it any less more your medium, you know? And I think that that's a very important idea to work with and to keep close to yourself. I'm sorry, I went on, but Amy, are there any comments or concerns? I think we have time for one more, right?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I actually wondered about asking something myself, just to, from what Shahzia was saying there around creating a lexicon, and I just really quickly wanted to sort of pick up on this Nancy Spiro reference that you made, because I think she also kind of does that to some extent in her work, but maybe with found materials, or taking, you know, what she sort of really identifies as master narratives and ventriloquizing them and kind of parodying them and using those strategies that maybe also parallel things that Kristeva or Sisut say. And I just wondered if those kinds of acts were interesting or useful to you at all.
Absolutely. I think I explored paper in in a lot of variations. So working on very thin, transparent paper where you would bulk it up with ink and let it dry, and then you would get very coagulated surfaces that would mimic skin, or like dried pigment would often look like dried blood. And so you could like project this idea, like the pressure of the brush on the pigment and the amount of pigment in the brush, like you could really explore forms through material. And of course, you know, that's just some one additional thing that many artists do. But in that, what I was curious was that how I could peruse through a lot of miniature paintings, because the experience of that tradition is that it is very truncated. There is no linear manner to it, right? So much of it is also unarchived and we don't know where it is. So if you think of the invisibility of it, then it's almost like it's expunged. So when I started to think of that aspect, then it started to fall in place with the notions of feminine expunging of history, and how even French linguist theorists talk about utterances and feminist discourse coming from a lot of Pakistani feminist scholars equally, except that many people would not necessarily know about them. So as I started to juxtapose those, forms started to actually evolve in both physical way as well as conceptual manner.
Thank you so much. Vivek, can we take Bilal's question as well?
Absolutely. I think this is our last final one, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much. A question for both Shahzia and Salman. A big fan of both of your works. I guess general question is, where do you each feel rooted, and how does that translate into your work?
I don't feel rooted. Just I feel like the figure in, like the floating figure in Shahzia's miniature paintings. It's got like It looks like a sausagey figure, and the sausage sort of, with the legs and the feet are like kind of, sewn up, and then it has like these dangling roots, and it's just sort of floating around. And I remember reading that you called it tree root leg.
It's been called many things.
Yeah.
But definitely it is about the roots that you carry with you.
Yeah. So I'm sort of like, that's my style, you know. Just floating around. I do feel that there is definitely a part of me that is married to an idea of progressiveness and feeling a safety that is, I think, for me now is linked to New York City, in the States. But that's just one. God, I feel like that's a bit myopic way of looking at it. Like I have many things. Yeah, that's all for me.
Yeah, and for me, it's really, I think every time it's like I feel rooted into the work. So that whatever that idea of home or rootedness is it's in the act of doing, and that basically grounds one whenever you're working, you're working. And for me, I can work anywhere. It need not be, I don't need a big mega system in a studio. I can work wherever. So it's very transient in that way, but it's very much about in the act itself.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I don't have anything really more coherent or eloquent to say than thank you for just incredibly rich and intelligent and, I don't know, exciting presentations as well. I mean, it was just so wonderfully put and so smart, and I enjoyed it immensely. Vivek, do you want to?
No, I would just say, just join me in thanking Shahzia and Salman for this great opportunity, and wishing that we'll be doing this in person soon at Cambridge. And thank you to the Center for Visual Culture for hosting this. And with that, that's the official end of our program. I will stop the recording.